Comienza en Bilbao la 12ª Vuelta Ciclista a España, que comprenderá 16 etapas. Además de los equipos nacionales, participan en la prueba los de Francia, Italia, Bélgica y Portugal. Se inicia la vuelta con la salida neutralizada de los corredores hasta las afueras de la ciudad. La primera etapa terminará en Vitoria con un recorrido total de 158 kilómetros.
Welcome back to the Cycling Iceberg podcast, everyone. That was a very short bit of commentary on the 1957 Vuelta a España, the topic of today's podcast episode. With the Vuelta underway, I will be covering a number of stories from the Vuelta history over the past couple of years. It will be an interesting journey covering kind of the rise of the Vuelta, because as you'll hear in this story, in 1957 the Vuelta was not prestigious at all. It wasn't considered a third Grand Tour or anything. That slowly changed over time, but only really in the last 10 to 15 years has the Vuelta gained a lot of prestige, and it's really a worthy alternative for plenty of riders to the Giro. So that's the story we'll be covering, and we're going to start kind of chronologically, starting with the first episode on the Vuelta, on the earliest story I wrote about La Vuelta in the Cycling Iceberg. The 1957 Vuelta a España was the perfect stage for the most heated rivalry in Spanish cycling. At the time, the Vuelta wasn't nearly as prestigious as it is nowadays. I already alluded to that. It was a mostly Spanish affair. It took place in late April, with most riders targeting the far more important Giro, which took place rightly after that, or the Tour de France, which was of course held in the summer. In terms of prestige, you should see the Vuelta as just a slightly bigger race than the others. I mean, there was at the time also the Tour de Suisse and the Tour of the Basque Country, and the Vuelta, it was a scene where the best Spanish riders came together. Occasionally there would be a few riders pipping in from outside of Spain, but mostly it were the Spanish riders up there. And that was no different in 1957, because the two favorites for the race were Frederico Bahamontes and Jesus Lorono. Despite being teammates in the Spanish team together often, they would constantly attack each other. They were perfectly fine not winning, as long as it meant that their rival didn't win either. The rivalry between these two men was mainly driven by a social divide. Bahamontes grew up in poverty, resorting to petty theft and killing cats with a slingshot at night to survive. Later he used similar tactics to buy his first bike. Despite this upbringing, he was seen as somewhat of an elitist. He hailed from Toledo, close to Madrid, in the fascist heartland of Spain. The dictator Francisco Franco was one of the biggest Bahamontes supporters in the country. Lorono, on the other hand, he was from the Basque Country, a region with a strong regional identity. Many of his family members were die-hard Basque separatists, who strongly opposed Franco's regime. Lorono was seen as the working-class hero, the people's champion. Though the two raced for different commercial teams, they were forced to be teammates in the 1957 Vuelta. Both riders had friends in the media, and it showed in the previews. Ahead of the Vuelta, newspapers favourable to Lorono brought up the previous edition of the race. In 1956, the two had been teammates, but again only on paper. They were engaged in a close battle against Italian Angelo Conterno for the overall victory. In stage 15, Bahamontes took the virtual GC lead with an attack in the middle of the stage. However, it was Lorono who helped Italian Conterno in the chase. They eventually caught up to Bahamontes, although the leading Spaniard did crash. On the final climb, Bahamontes sought revenge for this action. When Lorono attacked and seemed on his way to winning the Vuelta, it was Bahamontes' turn to help Conterno. When pictures surfaced of Conterno holding onto Bahamontes' jersey, devoted Lorono fans accused him of treason. Conterno won the Vuelta by just 13 seconds over Lorono that year. Hoping for a different scenario, Lorono got off to a good start in the 1957 Vuelta. He gained 2 minutes on Bahamontes in the first stage. But 2 days later, Bahamontes struck back with what already seemed to be a decisive move. He gained 14 minutes with a long-range attack, taking a comfortable GC lead. Of course, back then the time gaps were nothing like they were now. A 14-minute deficit with still pretty much the entire race to go wasn't something that was impossible to overcome. While Bahamontes was heavily favoured, Lorono was eager to show he wasn't out of contention. The day after being dealt that punch by Bahamontes, Lorono went on the attack. When he saw it was snowing, he knew he had to take advantage of this. It was a major weakness for Bahamontes, the cold. The leading Spaniard climber couldn't handle it, so Lorono launched an offensive, quickly gaining time. However, as conditions worsened throughout the stage was cancelled altogether. Lorono was furious and continued riding. He kept climbing until he reached Payares, where he had to be physically removed from his bike by race officials. In stage 8, Bahamontes gained 3 more minutes, but he saw an almost certain Vuelta win slip through his fingers in the 10th stage. Spanish veteran Bernardo Ruiz launched a 7-man breakaway attack with his ally Lorono. Bahamontes didn't expect any danger in this stage and sat at the back of the peloton. Even when that move went, he hoped others would react. He didn't take responsibility as race leader, and this meant he overplayed his hand. Once the break had a lead of 6 minutes, he only then started to initiate a chase. But he had to do all the work alone. His Spanish teammates refused to cooperate because they sided with Lorono, who was in the break. Bahamontes wasn't that loved within the Spanish team. He was more loved within the French team. Bahamontes was a climber. He'd not really raced the Vuelta as a target that often. He was the climber, the Eagle of Toledo, the one that went to the Tour. So he had more French team allies. Those came to his help, but it was too late. In an interesting move, there was an attempt to make a compromise. The Spanish director sportif, Luis Puig, ordered Lorono to drop back to the peloton. But of course Lorono refused. Puig then tried to block the road with his car multiple times, but Lorono continued. He told him, "I won't stop, even if you send the Guardia Civil after me." Why would he? He was after all on his way to win the Vuelta. He knew what was coming. The break made it to the finish and gained 21 minutes on Bahamontes, who was absolutely furious. He refused to eat dinner with his teammates that night, feeling they had betrayed him. The tables had been turned compared to the year before. The following stages were filled with insults and attack between the two rivals. After stage 13, the Spanish Federation intervened, sending a telegram warning them to behave or they would risk being disqualified from the Vuelta. Many thought this was bluff. Would the Spanish Federation really disqualify the two superstars of their biggest race, the two Spanish superstars as well? Many thought they wouldn't, but it did lead to the so-called Huesca Pact. Bahamontes and Lorono shook hands in front of the cameras, but the truce lasted less than 24 hours. Bahamontes raced the time trial with an illegal tri-spoke rear wheel, coming second, just 6 seconds behind the winner. He received a 1-minute penalty for the tri-spoke wheel, but Lorono was livid. He claimed to the race jury that Bahamontes had gained far more than a minute by using that wheel. It was the start of a final offensive by Bahamontes because he kept attacking in the final stages. Lorono, guided by Ruiz, managed to chase him down every single time. Eventually, a new compromise was reached. Bahamontes would be allowed to secure the King of the Mountains jersey on the penultimate stage. While Lorono agreed to this, he didn't trust Bahamontes at all. He suspected that once over the summit, Bahamontes would continue attacking. When Bahamontes realized Lorono was chasing him on the climbs, he declared the pact void and did what Lorono was fearful of. Bahamontes pressed on. Puig is said to have ordered race organizers to block Bahamontes on the descent, desperate to restore some form of calm within the team. Lorono ultimately won the 1957 Vuelta, a very bitter pill for Bahamontes to swallow. He later claimed that, ahead of the 10th stage in which he lost the race, he had received a telegram from the Minister of Sport instructing him to let Lorono win the race. Ignoring such orders under Franco's dictatorship could have been dangerous. Bahamontes never came up with any evidence for this telegram. He simply argued that a Basque rider winning the Vuelta, which was organized by a Basque country and held mostly in the Basque country, would help ease tensions between Franco and the region. However, there's clearly no evidence to support this theory, and the tactical blunder remains the more likely explanation as to why Bahamontes lost this edition of the Vuelta. For me, the most interesting thing about this era of cycling is that, and I've said it before, cycling was still kind of organized in pillars. You had the Spanish pillar, you had the French pillar, and you had the Italian pillar, and the rivalries were mostly within. There were no super heated rivalries between French and Italian riders. There were to an extent just between the teams, right? So there are stories that once the Tour de France visited Italy, the Italian fans threw tomatoes and threw stuff at the French riders, and vice versa. The Italian riders would feel less welcome in the French racing circuit. But the big rivalries, what were they in this time? You had, of course, Coppi and Bartali. You had here, which we just discussed, Bahamontes and Lorono. And in France, you had Anquetil versus Poulidor. And because these rivalries were all within one country, they were super divisive. And the cultural role these rivalries played were more significant than what you might see now. Because rivalries, of course, of the modern day, Van Aert versus Van der Poel, Pogacar versus Vingegaard, but they're more of a performance-based rivalry, and sure, I am very well aware that there are differences between them, right? Like the personalities of Vingegaard and Pogacar are different, and Van Aert and Van der Poel are also different in the way they appear, but I would definitely say they were less culturally rooted than the rivalries of the 50s and, well, also the late 40s. These were founded in, as I said earlier in the beginning of this story, like the upbringing, the region from the country they were from, but the region then being symbolic for, well, are we more in line with Franco's dictatorship or are we against it? Do we want like a more autonomous Spain or do we want a more unified Spain? And similarly, you see with Coppi and Bartali, religion played a role. So that's, I think, one interesting thing from this era, that these rivalries, because they were within a country, had a very different underpinning than the rivalries we see in modern day sports. That will be it for this episode of the Cycling Iceberg podcast. Thanks for listening, and I will catch you guys soon for another episode about La Vuelta. Goodbye.